Yitzhak HEN, who is professor of late antique and early medieval history at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and who is my dear colleague and the director of the Great Israel Institute for Advanced Studies. And Yitzhak, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Sadi, for the introduction, and thanks for inviting me over to Paris for a month of writing. I haven't had such a period of writing for a long time, as you well know. And I'm going to talk to you about a series of projects I was involved in and some of its results. So throughout late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, a vast corpus of potentially dangerous texts was disseminated as unorthodox and unauthorized by Christian scholars and policymakers. These texts expose their reader to unorthodox systems of thought and belief, and hence should have been eradicated. And yet, although these texts and the worldview they represent were repeatedly questioned, denounced, and condemned, they were still read, copied, and commented upon by a select group of Christian scholars who clearly realized the implications of what they were doing. Given the fact that the attitude towards these texts remained negative and reproachful, their preservation and use over time seem even more intriguing. In what follows, I should like to explore some of the mechanisms that allow the preservation, copying, and reading of such texts in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. My observations, let it be said at the very beginning, are rather preliminary, and they evolve from three different but interrelated projects I was engaged with in the past few years. The first is Western Arianism, which explores the nature and role of Arianism in the early medieval West. The second is entitled Forbidden Knowledge, and it deals with the transmission and reception of unorthodox texts and practices in the post-Roman world. And the third is a mini project conducted in collaboration with Irene van Renswoude from the University of Amsterdam, and it focuses on knowledge that either challenged established facts, norms, and values, or was challenged by new viewpoints or alternative doctrines. Since in all three projects the manuscript evidence appears to be extremely crucial in my work, manuscripts, as you'll see, will bulk large in what I have to say today. So let me start. What has Athens to do with Jerusalem, the academy with a church, or heretics with Christians? So asked Tertullian at the turn of the 2nd century, and thus exposed his unease as a Christian intellectual with the paganism of his cultural heritage. Tertullian was not the only one to feel awkward. Many generations of Christian scholars, from Augustine and Jerome to Gregory the Great and Isidore of Seville, felt the same. Even at the end of the 8th century, long after the pagan past ceased to be a threat, Alcuin of York, Charlemagne's chief advisor, disclosed similar sentiment when asking Speratus, a bishop of an unnamed see in Anglo-Saxon England, what has Ingold to do with Christ? Tertullian, Alcuin, and many of their fellow Christian thinkers knew exactly what the answer should be. There is nothing whatsoever that connects Athens with Jerusalem or Plato with Christ. According to them, these intellectual remnants of an older pagan world are incompatible with a Christian puritas mentis, and the language of purity and pollution comes up again and again. And yet, unlike Bishop Lucifer of Cagliaris, who enthusiastically orchestrated the public burning of pagan and Arian books in his hometown, most Christian scholars from the 3rd century onwards were less keen on implementing a radical policy on the matter. Realizing it is impossible to unchain their bonds with a classical tradition, they silently came to accept a practical dichotomy in which the classics might be studied and used as a means to promote Christian thought, but their paganism and morals should be condemned and rejected. These compromising solutions paved the way for the preservation and dissemination of a vast corpus of potentially dangerous pagan works that was soon enriched by the writings of anti-Christian polemicists and heretics, apocryphal treatises, unorthodox lore, and magical tracts. Although these texts and the worldview they represent were repeatedly condemned by smarmy official statements, they were still available to a select group of Christian scholars long after Christendom had established its own intellectual world. Although early medieval authors and scholars shared a certain notion of censura, censorship in the modern sense, whether regulatory or constitutive, did not exist in the early Middle Ages. Moreover, apart from a few sporadic and very local instances of book burning, there were no concrete systematic efforts to eradicate or control the production and dissemination of unorthodox texts, neither by secular authorities nor by ecclesiastical ones. In relation to that, some scholars have argued that effective censorship was impossible before the invention of printing, not only because the dissemination of texts in a manuscript culture was difficult to control, but also because neither the church nor the state possessed the necessary power structures and institutions of control. It is, of course, impossible to ascertain such an assertion, especially since there is no evidence whatsoever that points at a systematic process of censorship or the mechanism of implementing it. And in that respect, Umberto Eco, in his dazzling novel, The Name of the Rose, made that quite clear. Censorship, according to him, was not institutionalized, but rather a matter of individual initiatives. The lack of such evidence, I would submit, is extremely revealing. It suggests that those in charge probably never wanted to scrap unorthodox texts and practices from the face of the earth. Having said that, one should stress that some attempts to regulate the production, dissemination, and study of texts were definitely made throughout late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. Early medieval authors were engaged in the practice of censura praevia, that is, prior scrutiny. Before publication, texts were submitted to a higher authority for review, very much like the Catholic Church nihil obstat procedure or our modern academic peer review system. Although in the later Middle Ages, this practice was institutionalized and assigned to professional censors, throughout late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, the submission of a certain text to scrutiny was voluntary as part of a communal effort to control and regulate the dissemination of unorthodox ideas. An excellent case in point is the Vitae Ligi, whose first version was composed by Odoinus of Rouen in the third quarter of the 7th century. Odoinus sent a draft of the Vita to Bishop Chrodebert of Paris, who read it, corrected it, and returned it to Odoinus with numerous comments. And if you want to learn about Bishop Chrodebert's sexual scandals, I'll be happy to tell you about it over lunch. These were conscientious internal processes that were meant to cleanse the text from theological errors and other idiosyncrasies and to increase its authority. However, problematic and unorthodox texts were a completely different kettle of fish, and therefore necessitated different processes of adjustment and validation. Some of these were more systematic than others, and some were mere local enterprises initiated by private readers or scribes in order to deal with texts they deemed unorthodox, but still precious enough to be copied and studied. The first and most obvious tactic to purify a text and approve it for use was to clean it from anything unorthodox embedded in it. An outstanding example of such an editing process is to be found in the so-called opus imperfectum in Mattheum, which throughout the Middle Ages was wrongly attributed to Johannes Chrysostomus. This monumental exegesis on the Gospel of Matthew was composed towards the end of the 5th century, most probably in northern Italy, by an Arian commentator who was well versed in both Homoian and Nicene exegesis. However, sometimes during the reign of Theodoric the Great, the Opus Imperfectum, numerous Arian comments were edited out. The reasons for that are not at all clear. Unfortunately, the editor did not disclose his reasons. But I would argue that it was probably done in order to adapt the Opus Imperfectum to the tolerant religious message rejected from Theodoric the Great's court. Subsequently, the newly edited Opus Imperfectum enjoyed a wide circulation throughout the Middle Ages, as attested by more than 100 manuscripts that transmitted. This is a huge number of manuscripts. It was well regarded and constantly cited by some of the most important Christian theologians of the medieval West, among them John Scotus Eriugene, Peter Abelard, and Thomas Aquinas, all of whom were unaware of the text's Arian's origins and undertones. Aquinas once even said that he would rather have a complete opus imperfectum than be the mayor of Paris. It was only Erasmus who first, in 1530, refuted the attribution of the opus imperfectum to Chrysostomus and pointed at the Arian component in the commentary. Needless to say, after Erasmus, it was hardly studied or copied. This approach to the purification of text, however, was not welcomed by all Christian scholars. Jerome, for example, thought it was unacceptable and should be avoided. In a vicious letter, he scolded Rufinus for apparently cleaning the text he was translating from any Pelagian ideas. According to Jerome, one should warn the reader of the devious content of a text, but not touch the text itself, just as he did with his translation to Origenes. In face of such harsh criticism, it is not at all surprising that many scholars adopted the very same tactic applied by Jerome for the purification of texts and added warnings to the text they translated, copied, or simply read. One can get a glimpse of that in a 6th century Italian manuscript of Pseudo Rufinus, the Fide. Nowadays it is in St. Petersburg, and I apologize for the bad quality. They refused to send me better pictures. At the beginning of the treatise, a clear warning was added by a contemporary hand, and you can see it on the top. Let this book that is ascribed to Rufinus not lead you astray, O pious reader, because it is Pelagian and full of Pelagian heresies. While it pretends to be a dispute against the Arians and their poison, it is devoted to heresies. This is why I incite your charity to cut out this blasphemy, remove it from the codex, and copy in its place the book of St. Augustine on the true religion, to restore the size of the volume. One may wonder why the reader who added this warning did not act according to his own recommendation and remove these problematic treatises from the codex. And still, the annotator did not outright forbid his pious reader to read the Pseudo Rufinus, but ordered him to read it with care. The same is true for the short note that was scribbled in 8th century core B, at the end of the very same treatise, and here you can see it, this book is not by Rufinus, but by a Pelagian heretic, in which many blasphemies against the Catholic faith are preserved. No doubt, these warnings envisioned a future readership for Pseudo-Rufinus. Later annotations that were added in the margins throughout the manuscript clearly testify that the treatise was constantly read. Hence, acknowledging the dangerous and polluting content and adding a clear warning at the beginning and sometimes in the middle or at the end of a text was an elegant way to validate its importance and justify its preservation for future generations, albeit the spurious ideology it represents. And you can see here another example taken from Agbar of Lyon, Treatise Against the Adoptionist, and you see that on the margins he wrote, "Hey, male, pessime, oh, this is wrong, don't use it." It's just marking it so he could copy it. No less imaginative ways of dealing with unorthodox texts are revealed in the treatment of apocryphal compositions. In what is commonly accepted as the earliest reference to the apocryphal Acts of the Apostles, Eusebius of Caesarea recorded a series of spurious and dubious acts, which he condemned unorthodox and unauthorized. Yet the most outstanding point raised by Eusebius in his short note is the fact that these unorthodox and unauthorized compositions, although condemned by Christian authorities, were valuable, known to everyone, and read by many, not the least by churchmen. These gave the cue to the purification of apocryphal texts in the years to come. And let me give you just one example from the Merovingian period. Sometimes around 700, a lazy cleric at the scriptorium of Luxeuil in the north of Burgundy decided to incorporate the apocryphal Passio Petri et Pauli into his newly compiled lectionary. He did not change the text, nor did he apologize for using it. He simply thought it was good enough for his liturgical purposes, incorporated it into his newly composed lectionary, and by doing so, decontaminated it. No doubt it was a courageous and audacious move, but it proves to be a success and was silently accepted and approved by the lectionary's subsequent users. Not so long after the lectionary of Luxeuil was completed, someone added on the margins of the Passio Petri and Pauli which part of it should be read during Mass. And here you can see, lege ad missam et finit. He just marked out of this unorthodox text what should be read during unorthodox Mass. This brings me to the last point I wish to raise today, that is the unexpected role of liturgical codices and compilation as the most effective whitewasher of unorthodox texts and spurious knowledge throughout late antiquity and the Middle Ages. We have just seen how liturgy accommodated apocryphal lore into its liturgical cycles and prayers. In a similar way, it allowed the preservation of pagan texts. For example, the sacramentary of Echternach incorporated the so-called Tetrasticon Authenticum de Singulis Mensibus, an utterly pagan poem taken from the North African Anthologia Latina, and it was copied in between the sacramentary's calendar and some astronomical material. The same is true for magical lore. The Gelone Sacramentary, for example, contains a list of Egyptian days, the bad days that you shouldn't do anything in them. And this was copied on a blank space just before the beginning of the martyrology. Similarly, in a short text on bad days was inserted to a lavishly produced Anglo-Saxon psalter, where one could also find a charm against the theft of bees. Another charm, This time, to pacify a swarm of bees, was added to a splendid copy of the Apocalypse in 9th century Loesch. A charm for revealing the identity of a thief was added on a small scrap to Alfwin's prayer book. Several pagan charms in Old High German were copied, possibly in Fulda, on a blank page of a small liturgical handbook. And to give just one more example, at the end of the Irish Stoa Missal, someone added 3 spells in Old Irish, one for a bad eye, one for a thorn, and one for the disease of the urine. These examples are only the tip of an iceberg, and they represent a widespread phenomenon that allow the preservation of texts, practices whose orthodoxy was contested, but on the other hand, curated precious knowledge. The foregoing discussion and the various examples I've cited must not be taken to imply that I argue for a monolithic system against which certain texts were classified as forbidden, unorthodox, or potentially dangerous. No such a system ever existed, and there has never been an official office or body whose recommendation and commendation would be universally acknowledged and respected. Similarly, I'm not arguing for a dichotomy between orthodoxy and forbidden knowledge. Not only orthodoxy itself was not clearly defined and universally conceded, many of the questionable texts with which we are concerned gradually found their way into the mainstream intellectual consensus. The situation, it seems, was extremely nuanced and much more fluid than it appears at face value, and the study, transmission, and dissemination of supposedly unorthodox text had a complex political, social, and cultural implications that still needs to be explored. It is only by adopting a comparative approach to the sources and by analyzing them against a broader intellectual background that a better understanding of the cultural formation of the early medieval West will emerge. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yitzhak. Fascinating. Are there any questions or comments from our audience? And I will gladly leave them the priority because I have one burning question also. So if someone wants to talk or raise their hands, this is the moment. Pavel.
Okay, so thank you very much for the really fascinating talk on this fascinating subject. And well, I have one rather broad question and maybe a little comment. Yeah, so the broad question is, well, what you incorporated and the thing which raises some of my curiosity. What do you think? What is your division between the late antiquity and early Middle Ages?
I didn't get it. Sorry, can you repeat it?
What is in your view late antiquity and what is early Middle Ages?
Okay.
Yes, and well, another thing is that I find absolutely fantastic this study on these readers' colophons and some of quotations found in the manuscripts and so on. And so, you know, I'm working with Sogdian material. So the texts are religious texts which are translated from Buddhist texts, Christian, Manichaean. They don't say much about their community, but these colophons and things which are between the lines are sometimes very, very exciting. And so I just want to give one example. There is a Manichaean treatise, quite long, and between the lines, there is just one line saying that there is rain every day. So it was composed, it was copied, at least copied in Turfan, one of the driest areas in the world, in Western China. So the this was quite unusual to have clouds every day. So this text, so like the names of the spells and so on between the lines are very, very easy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pavel. Well, the definition of late antiquity and the early Middle Ages is, very fluid, and it depends geographically on where you're sitting and how politically correct you want to be. Nowadays in America, you're not allowed to use anymore the term early Middle Ages because it is a very white colonialist terminology. So I'm using it just to prove them wrong. You can't even use nowadays the term Anglo-Saxon, even when you're talking about the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of the early Middle Ages. You're not allowed to use that term. So it's very fashionable. Let's say that for me, late antiquity and the early Middle Ages is a continuum that starts somewhere in the 3rd century. I can't give you an exact date. Sometimes I'm even willing to go back to the death of Augustus and the rest Divi Augusti at the beginning of the 1st century, but that's an extreme view. So let's say something around the end of the 3rd century to the 9th century, more or less, with the rise of the Ottonian kingdoms, which is considered to be the Central Middle Ages. So it's a very long continuum, and it is different because the changes are different in different places. What's going on in North Africa is completely different from what's going on in the Byzantine East or in the shores of the Mediterranean in Italy and Spain, and what's going on in Anglo-Saxon England. So the pace of change is changing there geographically, but more or less we're talking about 3rd to 9th century. You have more or less half a millennium, which is, according to me, is defined as late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. So it's, again, and it's also a perspective how much you see this period as evolving from the Roman Empire and projecting from Byzantium to the West, and how much you think that the actually barbarians changed everything, and so the projection is from the north to the south, and so it is very debatable terminology. So, but let's talk about centuries. So 3rd to 9th century for me.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Yitzhak. Abdul, I saw you raised a hand at some point, or?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Yitzhak, for such a comprehensive and interesting talk. We know that understanding ancient religious texts, it's always tricky because we see that in the subcontinent, the early texts written in Pali and Sanskrit were translated by the Chinese pilgrims who came to this region during the from 4th to 10th century. And then later on, people started translating those Chinese accounts. Without, understanding the context and the religious methodology, so what do you think that how important is understanding the religious mythology and the context of the manuscript for the scholar who is going to decipher an ancient, text? So, yeah.
Yeah, well, it's one thing that is different between the type of material you're dealing with and the type of material I'm dealing with is that we have a constant language. All our texts were written in Latin and they continue to be copied in Latin. There is no translation, at least in the early Middle Ages. It comes back later, and from the 12th century, you have lots of problems of interpretation. But at least that transition is saved for me. So I think there is, when they are talking about heresies, they know exactly what they are talking about because they are talking about texts that they can understand and they comment upon. And I didn't show you here, but one of the manuscripts that I'm going to see at the Bibliothèque Nationale next week is just a 5th century argument that goes on in the margins against the main texts. And it's obvious that they're talking the same language. They know very well the theology that they are arguing against. So I think that's this shift, translation shift and change of language, which also change interpretation and understanding, because as we know, each translation is a creation of its own. I think this is saved for us, at least in the sources I'm dealing with. There are a few vernacular texts, but they are just starting to appear towards the late 9th century, and so it's not that crucial.
Okay, thank you.
We have 3 more questions. I have one, David, and then Anne. Very quickly, Yitzhak, what's your explanation for this? I mean, this is really weird. These guys are supposed to be the guardians of the orthodoxy, and they still keep what should be suppressed. So is this because they're at the same time intellectuals and guardians of knowledge? I'm struck by the figure of you cited the name of the rose, right? That this old librarian Jorge. He keeps the books, right? He poisons them, but he keeps them. So why?
I think that first we have to, there are 2 paradigms that goes into here. One of them is that knowledge is power. And if you want to fight heresies and you want to fight against them, it is very important that you read these texts and keep the knowledge. And especially when we're talking about Arianism, which was my first project, Arianism is becoming the archetypal heresy. So it comes up again and again and again. So that's really the knowledge of how we discuss theological matters. That's one thing. The other is the power of ignorance, which is a bad power. The power of knowledge is, you can control with it. The power of ignorance is very dark, and it comes up again and again in the discussion. If you want to keep this text, we'll lose a lot of things, and then we'll have to go backwards and start the process again. So I think that's the reason. And I think simply these people were intellectuals. They had a basic curiosity for knowledge. They wanted to know everything, even if it is forbidden. So how do you deal with the forbidden knowledge? That's the mechanism that interests me. You can put it in a liturgical text. You can write, don't use it, or be careful when you're using it. You can write commentaries on that. There are plenty of mechanisms to deal with it, but I think it's basic curiosity and sense for knowledge.
Thank you very much. I suggest that David gives this question and then Anne, and that you try to answer both, because we have like 4, 6, or 7 minutes. David, please.
I'm very interested because I work a little bit on censorship for a later period, for the 18th century, and I feel some similarity, but also quite a lot of differences, which are interesting. Well, the first, of course, is that in Middle Ages, it's less clear who is the owner of orthodoxy. Later on, it's clear. It's not so clear. There are many sources, but the main one is the Pope. But there are also other aspects which are maybe more interesting. One of these is the difference between a printed book and a manuscript. So a manuscript is something much less fixed, in which each copy can be different, and you showed how the same text can be interpolated in other texts. So I'm wondering. First question is, what's the role of the person that materially wrote the copyist in this process? Is him is only the author that are sanctioned of be heretic or not, or is also the copyist? And And the other one is about the straight or smooth border between orthodoxy and not orthodoxy. I have the impression, but tell me if I'm wrong, that in your time, in the time that you study, one text could be either orthodox and then permitted, or heretic and then forbidden, while later on there are many more notes of condemnation that can be put to a text. And so it's much more fluid, the border.
Yes, hi, Yitzhak. Thank you. That was wonderful. Also had a small question about the object manuscript, and I was curious about the margins. This white space on the side, is it thought of as a space for either the copyist or the reader to annotate? Is it common or not?
Okay, I'll try to answer all questions very briefly because our time is running out. First, about the Pope, just before the time of Charlemagne, and we are talking about a rather late time, the papacy had very little influence on what's going on in the West, definitely in the barbarian kingdoms. And so the guardians of orthodoxy were the local churches, and there were differences. That's the reason there are lots of heresies that's coming up, and there are local heresies. If you talk about the adoptionism that comes up from northern Spain into southern Gaul, but never reached northern France, and so on and so forth. So it is a very fluid system. The role of the scribe in all this process is extremely important, because some of the scribes and some of the copyists, like Agobard of Lyon, started as scribes but later became bishops. So they know these texts, they read these texts, they copy these texts, but most of the annotations are later. So it's the director of the scriptorium gives the direction what text should be copied, and later either he or another scholar from that community comment upon the text. What is important for me is the fact that most annotations are very close, as far as we can take, to the completion of the copying of the book. It's not as if someone 50 years later came up and commented upon them. It is a very, very tight, a close process, copying by the professional scribe and commentary and notes by someone else who is the scholar or considered to be more scholarly oriented than the scribe. That's one thing. As for the division between what is orthodox and what is not, I prefer to see it as a long continuum, because if you see what's going on the definition of what is a heresy and what is not is extremely blurred. And I've written a chapter on the for the Cambridge History of Magic that actually argues that we have to look at it as a very blurred continuum between what is orthodoxy and what is not. And what I'm saying there is that actually I'm tracing some magical practices that were supposed to be magical, and then look at what Gregory of Tours is doing them. Well, he's the Bishop of Tours. He's doing the very same things, but instead of, calling the doctor, he's calling the saint. But that's the same operation. It's the same mechanism. So I think it is a blurred, and it's in the eye of the beholder. There's no strict division, and I think that's also what gives permission to keep these texts, because these texts can't be all wrong. Some parts of it have, knowledge that is very useful and can be used, and therefore there is a reason to preserve it. And for Anne's questions about the margins, well, the margins were not considered to be part of the book. And so when intellectuals are looking at the margins, well, medieval intellectuals, they are putting some notes and some, I don't know, when we are putting the sticky notes nowadays on our book and saying, and with all sorts of comments, it's not considered to be part of the book, because sometimes even the scribes are writing on this margin notes that are completely disconnected with the text itself. We have from St. Gallen some manuscripts where the scribes are complaining, it is too cold today, I can't see, I'm tired, my hand is painful, and so forth, or I'm getting old, I can't see that much, and so I must sit next to the windows. Sometimes they put all sorts of lyrics. And so the margins were not considered part of the manuscript. Therefore, you can add anything you want on them. And for me, these intellectual notes are fantastic, because they are in many respects in dialogue with the text itself. And you can really see that. But the perception of the copying of a text is that the margins are not part of the main manuscript. Now, another note I must say before finishing is that these large margins are only in the deluxe manuscripts, because most of the manuscripts are not as beautiful as the ones you have seen today. They are tattered manuscript, intended. Most of our liturgical manuscripts are actually not very nice one, like the Luxeuil lectionary. They are a pocket book for a priest, a vademecum, that he can put in his bag and go with it. And he finds another charm that sounds to him useful, so he scribbles it in. And so, and you've seen some notes that were being added to the manuscript because there were no margins around to put it. So it's a very dynamic process of how you should add text to a manuscript and what consists a text of the original manuscript and what was added before it, because all these manuscripts were extremely expensive, so they were constantly used and changed and adapted, and you can see that in the process.